Hello, everyone. I want to go through the introduction to literary criticism. This PowerPoint is available on the module page, of course, but I thought it would help to maybe further elucidate some of these terms. So, what is literary criticism? I could back up here and say that if you become an English major, you're going to spend quite a bit of time in this world. There is no way for me to say this, there's no way to say this other than you'd have to be an English major to fully really get into the depths of literary criticism. However, everyone can at least be exposed to it here. So, what is it? It's an attempt to evaluate and understand the work of an author. Um, Basically, it's going beyond just the first level, which is reader response, which is something we'll talk about here. So let's talk about the various literary theories. Of course, reader response, something you're probably used to. Social criticism, which is in depth. Formalism, structuralism, deconstruction, and then I've added psychological, which is, of course, part of it. So I like this little quote here. As a scholar, you have the right and duty to stand in judgment of the text. When we say the word literary criticism, I would like to clarify that I don't mean criticism in the standard sense of being for example, a movie critic, which may be a bad example. But the idea of criticism is not just telling me what's good or bad about something, not just evaluating it in terms of um, quality, in terms of enjoyability, but the idea of literally using critical thinking and breaking down what is happening in any set of text in this case, but text can be anything. We can expand that to talk about film, music, of course, literature and movies, all these things. So let's talk about reader response first, real quick. This is basically the level that you would do up into high school, I suppose. It's the little kids version, as we'd say, not to be cruel, but it's the idea of I read it, I respond to it, like the old American Bandstand. I like it, I give it a 6, I can dance to it. It's really just sort of there for you to react. In other words, it can be valuable because you can use metacognitive properties and say, what is this causing within me? You can say, here is my response. And that's valid, but it's very shallow as a standard sort of methodology here. So aesthetic reading, afferent, of course, the idea of, and they spelled it different here, but the idea of you are either looking to, enjoy some reading, you sit down with a book, or you looking for information. So in reader response, really what you're talking about is the idea of how something hits you. What, you look at it and you come out of it and you say, oh, that was good. I like that. And that's fine. Um, let's get into some layers here. The first one is obviously social criticism. So we're going to start with Marxism. It can be argued that we can take social criticism and apply it across the board. And this is done all the time in politics. This is done not only just in literature, but of course in politics and in all kinds of situations that would uh, branch out. So for me, everything really starts with a Marxist approach because everything is sort of a subset in a way of this. That doesn't mean that if you are, for example, doing feminism, you are a Marxist, a communist. It's not that, but the approach is the same. And let me explain. So, of course, we're going to get into feminism, gender studies, culturalism, and so forth. But let's start with the basics here. Give you a little history lesson. Of course, we see the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union. It's concerned with labor practices, class theories, and economics. You can read on. What this really means is we have a ground up approach. We're going to look at two forces. We can imagine the way Marx looks at it is here is this bottom pushing up. It's a ground up. It's practical. It's Aristotelian. and it's pushing up against the forces pushing down, which are the oppressors. Of course, in history, you would talk about the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. So when you put this lens on, and all of these criticisms that we're trying to learn here is ultimately what we're doing is saying what kind of lens can we put on. So you imagine you can look outside your window and it's a spring day, but you can put on some bright, glasses, those yellow blue blockers, and say, well, it's brighter outside. Or you can put some sunglasses and say it's dim. In this case, we're putting metaphorical lenses of how do we view ontology? How do we view what's happening? So if you're going to be purely Marxist in your evaluation of anything, social conditions, you look at it like there is an oppressor and there is an oppressed. And you start from there and you ultimately end there. So if we were talking about politics, someone who would lean into Marxist theory, or at least apply it, would say, well, it's not fair because, Elon Musk has all the money. He's the guy that always gets the attention. And therefore, he should be attacked because somehow he is an oppressive force. You can literally pull in history for this, but ultimately the idea is to apply this to whatever condition, subject, if you want to say object, because it could be, then that's what it is. The idea is to bring about a classless society. So you are looking for the struggles. So as a Marxist critic, you put the lens on and you say, okay, I'm going to do a Marxist criticism of, let's say, Harry Potter. Now, someone could say Harry Potter has nothing to do with politics, Marxism, communists, politics, nothing. It doesn't matter. You have the right as the critic to say, I'm going to put the lens on and evaluate it. This is what you need to do for critical theory. So you could look at Harry Potter and say, okay, Harry represents the working class. He is oppressed. He's forced to live under the stairs. Obviously, the people in power have usurped the real authority of the people. Even though Marxism is definitely Aristotelian ground up, you could say that its roots come from a Platonic idealism that says ideally we should all be equal. So this is why I said in my earlier lectures that you cannot just say Plato and Aristotle fit categorically left or right on the political spectrum. So I don't want to go on too much, but it says right here, Marxist critics suggest that the struggle is inherent in our society, so it's reflected in our literature, and then you can replace literature with any situation that you so choose. So just remember, it reveals how the author, readers, and characters demonstrate awareness and economic and social situations. Keep in mind also that we don't want to go too far until we get into formalism from the writer's intent, pardon me, because we are ultimately trying to say what is the creator, the writer, whatever it be, trying to convey. And we can have some liberty with that, but we need to not stray too far. So let's take that approach of us versus them, oppressed versus oppressors, the idea of looking to fight against a system, and then instead of making it purely political, economic, communist, capitalist, we now take that formula and apply it to the gender issue of man, woman, and all the gender roles that fit within that construct. So, of course, Rosie the Riveter with feminism is a fantastic place to start. We have Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. It looks like Chopin. And that is it's probably the easiest lens to do a feminist lens. So what does this mean? You are examining works by women and about women, typically, of course. That doesn't mean you have to have the work be by a woman or about a woman. You can apply the lens. So it's, in other words, the feminist perspective can be applied across the board. It doesn't matter the intention of the work. Let's look at Harry Potter again. I don't have this. Maybe I should put this on the screen here. But you could say Harry Potter represents a feminist, and he is trying to learn, or possibly he's a potential feminist who's been structured in a world that oppresses women, and his struggle is akin to the struggle of women to achieve power. Again, people would say, what are you talking about, Dever? Harry Potter is not a feminist. It doesn't matter if you can prove it, if you can find the evidence. It's not inventing, it's discovering what's there and applying the symbolism. So It's a Marxist take, of course, because we have us versus them, except, and this is a great line here, feminism by contrast has tended to take a stronger line. And why do they do that? Because typically it's a lot safer. If you are in the street saying, I am for communism, I am for full-blown socialism, most people, especially in the United States, are going to be against you. Most critics are going to be against you. When you take a feminist approach, you have a leg to stand on because you can make the argument that obviously 50% of our world are females, and so then now you have this. Uh, you have a leg to stand on. You could say, okay, obviously it's a male-dominated society, and I'm just reporting this. I'm not inventing that. So this, it's interesting. You could talk about, there are many pieces of literature. I think of like Lady Chatterley's Lover, for example. When I was in grad school, we were studying this, and the idea that sex and gender sometimes sit at the core of the human existence. Uh, this is why it's more important. And you can argue that, people can argue that all you want, but it's amazing how much this issue of the relationship between the sexes, the power balance, the nature of the roles themselves, we see now with, you know, this flexibility at times, in some people's opinion, and others saying there is no flexibility, that it's still valid. It's still a real important issue. And so this is a great one to use. So let's look at an easy one, examining Cinderella. It's a misogynist theme, right? If we look at it. Here is an abused girl waiting to be rescued by men. You have a prince. We have the new Snow White movie that came out that's just being shredded because it went away from the traditional into this more feminist, I would suppose. But this one's Cinderella. You can see it. What else? Men go to the ball and choose these women as if they're property based on what? Not their power, not their intelligence, nothing, but in terms of pure beauty, their aesthetic appeal, the beautiful dress, the beautiful hair, and the femininity. And then you have the wicked stepsisters. They're physically ugly. So there it is, keeping her down. Now let's take feminism and let's take that same Marxist approach in theory and apply it to gender. Again, this, I remember doing this in 2007 when this was really controversial and really sort of new. And now you see this applied across society. And again, we're not going to get into a political argument, but it takes that same sort of approach and say, wait a minute. Queer study will say, and you see the term queer study being used less frequently. That was the preferred term. And now I think they've moved into more of the gender study or LGBTQ awareness. You know, the language has changed, but it's the same thing. The idea of sexual orientation is not limited by biology. And so when you take that lens, you can then apply this the same way you would as a Marxist approach, us versus them, the same way you would to feminism, but replace purely female with the idea of a traditional, with the idea of the non-traditional, or even what they would say non-binary, or how are we even going to construct gender as a binary issue to begin with. So from that, what you usually would see back in the day, coming out of the late, I'd say 70s, 80s is where it really gets going. And of course into today, literature regarding homosexuality, perception of homosexuality, from that or within that, the gender issues themselves. But again, you could put that lens on. You could say, let's look at Harry Potter again. I should have a Harry Potter thing on everyone and just change the images, like have a little Harry Potter and hey, he could have a pride and he could be a woman, he could be a communist. But it's the same thing. We could say that Harry Potter represents a trans individual who has been kept in the closet, literally, or just a purely homosexual individual. And then when he's let out of the closet, Dumbledore, as the older gay man, teaches him to accept and embrace his homosexuality. And there, I could write this, you know, wow, if someone's out there watching, this is a good inspiration for you. In other words, it's there. It's not something the author created, but if you can find the symbols and connect them, you have it. So let's move into cultural theory, which is very similar. It's still a social issue. It still has a Marxist root. and it's the idea, what is it's a little evolved, but it's the idea of culturally, um, what has been the relationship and the reaction between different racial groups and between different cultural groups. And I stress culture because culture goes way beyond gender or race or nationality or religion. Culture really just exists as the aspects. Think about culture when we do spec. It's the idea of music, food, dance, dress, style, voice. So this is Goethe. Those who know nothing of foreign languages do nothing of their own language. This is so true. Study some Spanish, study some Italian, study some German. It's amazing because I have a degree in English here and a master's, and I can tell you that it's probably the most confusing language. I did a lot in terms of when we were doing what they would say was black literary criticism. You would do, that's what when I was in college. And when you get into African American literature, as we would say, you really can appreciate this, the use of language, the use of culture. The other part of that is the idea of what is seen and what is not seen. So again, this isn't some, ultra liberal take on, be aware of culture. But if you're putting the lens on, this is what you need to do. You would say, okay, typically up above the iceberg is what people witness, but a cultural study would say, hey, you out there, you need to take a look at what's underneath. So that's sort of it with the Marxist, the social criticisms. I want to get into real quick formalism. Now, what is formalism? Well, I'm going to explain it here. Typically, this is something that is not really been in style. You have to think of these things as what's been in style. Like we could think of the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. Dresses come in, and this is the style, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Now we're past the 80s. So formalism, when we're thinking about formalism, we're really sort of thinking about the idea that we're going to go back here to about let's just call it the 20s and 30s. And what does this mean? It emphasizes the close reading of the work itself. Uh, you can read this here on your own. What does it mean, really? Okay, what it really means is do the opposite of the book report. When you were in high school, way back when, for me it was 40 years ago, they would say, do the book report. And this was written, The Great Gatsby was written by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and it points to a time in history. Yeah, no one cares. Formalism comes out of that where they say, you know what? No, do not even look at the author's name. Do not look up anything about him. Do not look up anything written about the work or anything else. In other words, it is the text itself. Pardon me. So what this means is they would look at it like once the book is written, once the song is out there, once the commercial, whatever it is, the film, it becomes yours. In other words, you, by witnessing it, take ownership of it and can do whatever you want with it. And it stems from these language theories, too, the idea of they were really getting into, they weren't ready for deconstruction yet, but they were getting into this idea of what does language mean? Can we ascertain meaning? And it's interesting because from here we're getting into structuralism, but the idea is it exists on its own. Now, no one is really going to do a formalist approach anymore. If you were to do a formalist approach, I would admire you. What you can do, however, is you can use this general way of thinking to influence your strategies, I guess, and say at times, I need to get away from the book report and I need to focus on the text. There is a world that exists on its own, and that is it. Sometimes I'll teach the novel, and I use Cormac McCarthy often. I love Cormac McCarthy's writing, and we'll do a novel called Blood Meridian. I've also done No Country for Old Men, and I'll say, I want you to ignore anything about McCarthy. I want you to ignore the movies. I want you to just get into this world. And when you do that, you're sort of doing a formalist approach. So that's just something to think about. In other words, the text belongs to the reader. You get there and it becomes your own. The guys, if you're interested, I.A. Richards, he's British, and then John Crowe Ransom. That's just for your own perspective here. And this is just kind of what I said. It's the idea of to have that objectivity. You're not going to say, I'm going to look up everything about this, and then, no, it's the opposite of that. So, what is structuralism? This is difficult, but not as difficult as the opposite, which is deconstruction. What structuralism is, uh, basically, it's the way of saying they had the idea that we could find a formula that would identify whatever it is, the book, in this case it was literature, whatever it is, and you can identify it and find out what it's all about. And literally what you do, and I think I have a word bubble on here, it's like one of these. So if you do a structuralist approach to a text, you are looking for patterns, you are looking for literal repetition. I did a structural analysis one time of, oh, I'm trying to remember who it was. It wasn't Poe, but anyway, I was literally counting words. The professor had me counting words, so I would go through. I wish it was the internet back then. You could probably scan it and let AI do it, but I was literally counting words, and it was something like chapter one had, 800 words. Chapter 2 had 700 words. Chapter 3 had 400 words. And then from there, the professor would say, okay, what does that tell you? And what it meant is time is fleeting. It's like we're running out of time. Um, you could also look at it like what word gets repeated most often. What word, it's really odd. And it didn't last long because the criticism to structuralism, this is like in the 50s, the criticism of that and what happened as a result of this is people said the opposite of this is true. You can't just lock in the words. You have to bust out because there really is no meaning. In other words, they would say everyone knows what the word mind is. Everyone agrees 100%. So therefore, when you see the word mind, everyone knows what that is. Well, then the deconstructionists come along and change it all. So structuralists argue for the possibility of analyzing literature text systematically and scientifically. So there it is. You're counting. You're creating logs of meters. It's difficult. No one really does it. The only thing you could use this for is if you notice certain patterns. Why does something get repeated? Why does something get omitted? That's something. Now here's deconstruction. I can tell you right now that I did a 16-week course on deconstruction. I've taught it for 15 years, and I still don't think I'm qualified to teach it. Go ask any of the professors at ACC. Say, hey, can you teach me deconstruction in 1 hour? And they will look at you like, okay. What is it? Even deconstruction itself is hard to define. I like this here. It's the idea of discovering meaning by difference. So it's like you start with, and I like doing when I teach mythology, we get into this idea of fracturing and this idea of difference, the idea of starting from nothing and you build from there. And what happens in deconstruction is basically you can wind up going down rabbit holes, but here's a great cartoon. What you're ultimately trying to understand with deconstruction is that there is no meaning to anything. The fact that you are watching this video and listening to my voice, I don't need my bass on here today. The fact that you can process words that are coming out of my mouth is nothing short of a miracle. And with that, you need to understand that what you take as X could really mean Y. There is no meaning at all to basically anything. It's just a matter of agreement in numbers. That's the part of it. So it's very much focused on language. Saussure's analysis of language, post-structuralism, that means after structuralism, the one where they count everything. So this is post. After that, they get into this idea of the opposite being true, that the relationship between language and meaning, ultimately rejecting any certainty of meaning. So in other words, they say, no, you can never, ever determine what anything is about by language because no one can really understand language because what I say and what you hear are two different things. And that goes way beyond just the, oh, you're from the country and I'm from Chicago, or you're Asian and I'm Hispanic, or you're a woman and I'm a gay man. It has nothing to do with that, although that is added to it. In other words, just the fact of language being a miracle means that there is no such thing as actual meaning. Never. From there, you get an expansion into what would be called deconstruction ultimately becomes what's called postmodernism, and that gets associated with moral relativism. How does that work? Well, I can talk about that in a minute. Come back to that. So, what does deconstruction do? Ultimately, let me just talk about this. Ultimately, it was a political power. The professors in the 80s discovered this. I think of a guy named Stanley Fish. It was started by a guy really named Jacques Derrida, was the real famous one. But Stanley Fish is in Chicago, and he ultra liberal way of looking at things to say there is no right and wrong. Majority does not rule. Nothing means anything. Throw everything away and start from scratch. It's not pure relativism. People say it's relativism. They're getting off the rails here. It comes from the idea of there being no set meaning. So the idea is from that is if you don't see things the way we do, which is anything could be anything we want, and there is no set, definition. If you don't see it like that, then you are left behind. There's something wrong with you. You're a dinosaur. And a lot of professors were fired. A lot of students were really just kind of kicked to the curb by this ultra liberal methodology. And it's sort of run its course, but until something comes along, this is the last sort of standing way of looking at things. And it's still out there. 9/11 kind of killed it. But look what this does for a tool. It's a very effective tool. It allows you to determine meaning when an image, object, or situation is unfamiliar and ambiguous. So let me go back. I actually clicked it. So again, in a way, when I say, well, I'm going to apply queer theory or whatever to Harry Potter, in a way, I'm acting in the realm of deconstruction. I'm using the tools of deconstruction by saying, to me, this is what it means, so I can use deconstructive methods. You can discover covert or unintentional meanings. It doesn't mean you're inventing it. It means you're saying, well, this is what it means to me. When I would teach for Northwood, I would teach interpersonal communication. And one of the things that I would teach in terms of language, I would say, okay, everyone close your eyes. I'd be on, do this live and say, close your eyes. You can do this here, watching this video. Close your eyes and picture what I say in your mind. Ready? Yesterday, he spent a long time at the bank. And then I would wait, and then I would show an image of a gentleman fishing on a riverbank. And I say, that's what I meant. And everyone's, oh, wow, and they had something different. So in other words, when you realize it's something simple as he spent some time at the bank, you can't even understand that, then how could you possibly grasp the idea of institutions that are far away, cultures, lifestyles, whatever it is, the image. So here's a criticism created by some very intelligent and very disturbed people who view literature as having no meaning because language has no meaning. Basically, you can never really know what a meaning of a story is because words are so abstract. So why does it get to moral relativism is the idea of if there is no up or down, right or wrong, then it doesn't really matter. There is no good or bad. There is no God, devil, heaven, hell, anything. You can apply it across the board. There is no evil. There is no. Many would argue. You could get another professor in here who would say, well, that's not what it means. And again, moral relativism should not be the core of deconstruction, but it has sort of been associated with that. Okay, finally, you have the psychoanalytical, which is important because we live in a world populated by human beings, and we get into the idea of how are these elements affecting the way we view the world, the way we view anything, especially literature. So you can look at a couple people. I like to talk about Freud and Jung. So the idea with Freud, you can, of course, if you've studied psychology, you can understand the Oedipus complex. So the idea of the childhood repressed. This comes from the again focus, in my opinion, too much about dreams, too much sexual, and then Jung comes later, and it's the idea of the template being there. That's the idea of the hero's journey, which we'll get to. So you can see this here. This is where you can start applying these layers again, put the lens on. Why is a character doing a certain thing? Why are the creators doing a certain thing? Um, so there you go. Here we go with this. Jung is the guy. I do like Jung. He developed the theory of the collective unconscious. Now, stop right here and look at this. This is something that many struggle with, but I actually believe it's true. The idea that all the thoughts that every person who's ever lived and will live sort of form a cloud somewhere in the universe, maybe not in our dimension that we could see, and we can tap into that. That it exists as a bank of ultimate knowledge. We're getting into metaphysics here. Take my mythology course, we can talk a lot about it. So then when you think about applying this to literature, you would say, okay, since every thought, every experience has already been had, then, if you dip the ladle into that well of experience and knowledge, then patterns can be determined. Again, this is more like mythology. In other words, who is this character? What does this character represent? What does this person represent in terms of their belief system or their behaviors? And then from that, it's not just a piece of literature, but us ourselves. We are the manifestations. Nietzsche does this in Eternal Recurrence. So Jungian, it's not Jungian. Jungian analysis of literature tries to discover the images in a work of literature that are a permanent and universal significance. So he's very much into that. So it's the archetype. It's the idea of when you say you don't know me, yeah, I do. There's been 77 million people exactly like you. Okay, just the fact that you don't see them doesn't mean that you're anything special. And this isn't to diminish anybody, but it's the idea of you're dipping from a pool, not just the gene pool, but the collective unconscious. So everything is going to reflect in universal themes. This sort of would go against deconstructive means in a lot of ways. There are patterns of behavior, and then you could also establish maybe some moral patterns, of course, and it says right there, traditional morality. So here you can talk about the typical, when you do writing, is it the hero? Is it the shadow? Is it you think about like The Lion King, which is a take on Hamlet. Okay, and then you can start identifying the characters and even say Rafiki. Rafiki is like the Dumbledore character. He is the wizard, the old mentor. And in other words, you look for the patterns. And this is a great one to again have in the toolbox. Journey. By the way, the journey is called a Bildungsroman. If you ever look at that, it looks like one word. It's Roman construction. Bildungsroman, and that's just a journey. In other words, the journey of growth. So I think we're almost done. There it is, right there. Bildungsroman. I knew I had it in here somewhere. So it's the idea of the growth story. So again, you could say Harry Potter is a Bildungsroman. The idea of Roman building, in other words, the construction of a character who has gone through the journey, gone through the process. So other forms would be historicism, womanism. What womanism is black feminism. So in other words, this is very specific here, womanism, because it's the idea of the black female goes through a situation that almost no other combination would go through. Is it a person who happens to be a woman who happens to be black, or a black person who happens to be a woman? And the books written about that's fantastic. Ecofeminism really just takes that feminist approach and applies it to the idea of the environment and ecology, and that post-colonialism is interesting. Readership is, that's sort of, people were like, well, let's talk about readership. the idea of evaluating by who's reading what, and it's there. It hasn't really caught on. So that's the end of that. Let me show you something real quick here. These are samples I'm going to put on our pages here, but I want to talk about it really quick because this is pretty cool. These are samples that I took from students in the class. So when you're writing a critical analysis essay, you're going to try to take one of these lenses, you're going to try to apply it, and you're going to start to say, what's really going on? So here's someone's doing that Rosie the Riveter image. We can do it. And you can see what they're talking about here. I have not really edited any of this unless there was just a typo. Um, the first thing that jumps out in this poster is simply the bright eye-popping contrast. The background is a rich yellow. This really sets the red of the girl's bandana and the blue of her shirt apart from the rest of the image. Interesting, because you'd say yellow is a neutral color. We've done this before. The phrase "we can do that" is greatly visible. So in other words, you could say, okay, big deal. They're not getting deep. They do get deeper in there. I wanted to point this out because what they're doing in the essay is actually pointing out, just like when you did your work, if you did it right, um, for the Journal 6, you would say, okay, what is there? You're noticing what the author says. So when the author says, well, in the American Gothic, we see the serpent, we see the steeple, we see all the stuff, the details. Well, that's important because you go, oh, I didn't notice that. So make sure you are literally pointing out the details. It's interesting. Many of my students like to do ads, like to analyze ads, and they typically go into this either a feminist lens or finding something that's sexual to try to, to just point it out. It's true. But I found this one interesting. They took this Got Milk ad by Lady Gaga, the Got Milk, a very famous ad about 20 years ago, and carried on for since then. And it's interesting what they say. Says the origin of red lipstick is rather gross. Now, again, I probably would comment on this and say, okay, can you change that wording? Can you elevate the language, please? Instead of saying rather gross, I would eliminate that and say, um, dubious origins. It was used in Mesopotamian Egypt. It was used as an identifier rather than cosmetic purposes. Prostitutes would wear it to identify themselves. So it's interesting they do this, and they're not saying Lady Gaga is a prostitute. They're saying historically red lipstick has carried on culturally as a symbol of it's a prurient, as we'd say, connotation. Now you have the controversial use. I like that they use that word. They don't just say the use of lipstick. They add an adjective, the controversial use. And then the position of her mouth, and they talk about this. So again, I'm just going to be honest here because it's also entertaining. Not the greatest essay, but this is this kind of work that was done. Okay, here's another one. A student chose to say that James Bond, who is, always the good guy, always kills the bad guys, always gets the girl, that they are making a comment that he's closeted homosexual, sleeping with his gun underneath his pillow, as it's a symbol of, it's a phallic symbol, I suppose, is what they're saying. Talking about how women are just a means to an end. So again, that's probably not the author's intent. I've never seen that. I like James Bond movies, but this author, this student, decided to see something that was there. Again, you don't have to create. This is a stretch, but it's pretty good. This one I found on the internet. I think this is hilarious. Maturity is realizing that in the film Titanic, Rose decides to throw away a $250 million pendant in memory of an unemployed man she slept with exactly once. So again, a little a little exaggeration, but it's pretty funny. When you read through this whole thing, the real villain of Titanic, it's Rose. So, when you look back at this, the idea of doing literary analysis, critical analysis, is to say, what, when you're done reading it, whoever writes it, the person reading it goes, you know what? Now that I think about it, man, this person's got a lot of points. And that's really all you're doing. That's all you really got to do. So there's that. The other one here I want you to look at is, I'm going to have this online. This is an essay that was turned in many years ago. I hinted at this before, and it was about this here. This is that ad. I believe this is from Germany or Sweden. I'm trying to remember here. But you see the Scream image, and this student really does a nice job. This was an A paper back then. So I would like you to look at this. And if you say, well, how should my essay look? It should look like this. And I like this soft language. Some would argue, and say, instead of saying I think or what's good, don't ever say the word you, please. Please get away from that. So I want you to look at that for language. I want to use the style there. I want you to really just read this. If you're saying, well, what do you want? What do you want from me, Mr. Dever? I want this. Write this, get your A. So that's all I got for you right now. I hope that wasn't too long. I appreciate your time.